What if debt wasn't just an economic tool, but a fundamental force shaping society? What if money didn't emerge from barter, but from trust, obligation, and power? And what if the financial systems we take for granted, student loans, national debt, corporate bailouts, were just the latest chapters in a millennia-old struggle over who owes what and to whom? David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, challenges everything we think we know about money, markets, and economic fairness. Far from being a simple financial contract, debt has always been a means of control, used by empires to extract wealth, by religions to impose moral obligations, and by modern financial institutions to keep individuals and nations in cycles of dependency. The book is a sweeping journey through history, showing how debt has built and broken civilizations, shaped revolutions, and determined who holds power in society. But Graeber's work is not just about the past, it's about us, right now. Why do governments bail out banks but let citizens drown in student loans? Why do some debts get forgiven while others are ruthlessly enforced? Are we trapped in a financial system designed to keep us perpetually owing? More importantly, can we change it? This analysis will take Graeber's insights and push them further, using logical triads to uncover hidden patterns in how debt works, not just historically, but in today's world. By mapping out the ways debt reinforces itself, how it ties into moral and political power, and when societies have successfully broken free, we aim to find answers to urgent modern questions. Understanding these dynamics isn't just about history. It's about the choices we face today, and the futures we might still create. David Graeber challenges conventional economic narratives by arguing that debt, and by extension credit, has always been more than just an economic tool. It is a social relationship, a form of power, and a structuring force in human societies. In Debt. The First 5,000 Years, he dismantles the idea that money arose from barter, instead showing that early economies were built on trust and credit systems, long before coins were minted. Nowhere is this more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, where economic transactions were not based on immediate exchanges, but on mutual obligations recorded on clay tablets. Graeber describes a world where people relied on credit to conduct business, and that credit, in turn, depended entirely on trust. A merchant might provide grain to a farmer expecting repayment after the harvest, or an artisan might supply tools with the understanding that compensation would come later. These were not isolated exchanges, but part of a larger network of relationships. Because people knew each other and had a stake in maintaining their reputations, credit was not just an economic convenience, it was the foundation of social stability. This created a self-reinforcing system. Trust enabled credit, credit sustained commerce, and widespread participation in these obligations strengthened social cohesion. This dynamic represents a clear triadic relationship. Trust and credit were inseparable. Without trust, no one would extend credit, and without credit, economic activity would slow to a halt. But neither existed in a vacuum. Credit functioned because it was embedded in social structures, meaning that debt obligations weren't just financial contracts, but ties that bound people together. In a world without modern financial institutions, where contracts were often unwritten and enforcement relied on communal relationships, the economy itself was upheld by the trust people placed in each other. This ancient system finds surprising echoes in today's digital economy. While modern financial institutions have long dominated the world of credit, the rise of peer-to-peer transactions, social media economies, and platform-based reputation systems is recreating a similar structure in an entirely new context. Instead of a Mesopotamian farmer depending on the trust of his neighbors, an Uber driver depends on his customer ratings. Instead of credit being granted based on personal relationships, digital trust scores and online reviews determine who gets to participate in economic life. Trust, in this new economy, has become something measurable. On platforms like Airbnb, LinkedIn, or eBay, an individual's reputation is quantified and publicly displayed, allowing strangers to interact economically with a confidence that previously required personal relationships. Credit, too, is evolving beyond traditional banking, as microfinance, decentralized lending, and reputation-based loans enable financial access based on social credibility rather than collateral. These new systems create their own form of social cohesion, where digital platforms facilitate trust and structure economic relationships, reinforcing the very networks they depend on. Yet, just as ancient trust-based economies were vulnerable to disruption when trust was lost, whether through war, famine, or systemic failure, modern digital trust systems face their own risks. A bad rating, an algorithmic mistake, or a sudden change in platform policies can erase someone's ability to participate in economic life, much like how a Mesopotamian debtor who lost credibility might be excluded from commerce. The fundamental lesson from Graeber's work is that debt and credit are never just financial instruments. They are embedded in social structures that can either reinforce or exclude, sustain or collapse. By examining this triadic structure, we gain a deeper understanding of both historical economies and the digital landscapes emerging around us today. The key question is whether modern systems will recreate the organic interdependence of the past, or whether they will introduce new forms of control and exclusion. If trust is now mediated by algorithms rather than human relationships, do we still have the power to shape the terms of economic participation? Or are we entering an era where reputation itself becomes a commodified asset, one that can be granted, withheld, or manipulated in ways we barely understand? Looking at history through this lens helps us navigate these challenges and forces us to ask whether the systems we are building truly serve us, or whether they are leading us toward a new kind of economic dependency. David Graeber carefully illustrates how debt can transform into a self-perpetuating cycle, strengthening and expanding systems of political and economic domination. Perhaps no clearer historical example exists than that of the Roman Empire. Rome's growth into a powerful imperial force required continuous military expansion. New territories had to be conquered and held by force. Maintaining an empire this vast demanded tremendous financial resources, not just for soldiers and weapons, but also for administrative and logistical support. Thus, Rome's aggressive expansion inherently necessitated enormous ongoing spending. This ongoing military expansion set the stage for heavy taxation of conquered peoples. Once Rome established dominance in a region, imperial administrators swiftly imposed taxes and tribute obligations, often demanding payments in specific forms of Roman-approved coinage. Populations that previously conducted economic exchanges informally, using localized barter or credit systems, suddenly found themselves forced into monetized economies, obliged to acquire Roman currency to pay their taxes. This pressure transformed local economies, compelling inhabitants to participate within Rome's standardized monetary framework, in effect expanding Rome's fiscal control over newly dominated territories. With conquered populations now dependent upon Roman-issued money, a third structural element emerged: clearly widespread indebtedness. The heavy taxes and tributes imposed by Rome forced farmers, artisans, and local authorities alike into regular debts as they struggled to obtain currency for tax obligations. Debt thus became widespread and institutionalized. Individuals became increasingly reliant on moneylenders, state-issued coins, and debt instruments, embedding them deeply within Rome's financial systems. As debts multiplied, Rome's economic hold tightened, deepening the conquered population's dependence on the empire's monetary system and administrative structure. Yet crucially, this system formed a self-reinforcing loop. The debt-driven monetary economy was not a mere side effect. It actively encouraged and funded further military expansion. As tax revenues and debt repayments poured into imperial coffers, Rome financed more soldiers, more weapons, and more distant conquests. Thus, military conquest necessitated taxation. Taxation created systemic indebtedness, and indebtedness reinforced and incentivized further military expansion. This cycle was self-sustaining, each element intensifying and perpetuating the others. Today we see striking parallels to Rome's logic of reinforcement in modern nation-states' military-industrial complexes. Military ambitions prompt governments to maintain high levels of defense expenditure, which they finance through debt issuance and increased taxation. These debts entrench states into reliance upon complex monetary and fiscal management systems, reinforcing centralized financial control and institutional power. In turn, defense spending and procurement sustain entire sectors of the economy, generating political and economic pressures for continued or expanded military budgets. Just as Rome's debt-financed military conquest encouraged ever more expansionist endeavors, modern defense budgets and military strategies often perpetuate themselves, becoming politically and economically self-justifying cycles. Understanding this reinforcing triad pattern through Graeber's historical lens helps illuminate not only the past, but also today's economic and political structures. The cycle of military ambition, public indebtedness, and monetary dependence has lasting implications, pointing toward why modern societies find it challenging to reduce defense spending, manage national debts sustainably, or reimagine more equitable and humane economic priorities. Recognizing this dynamic clearly, as revealed through Rome's historical example, offers a critical vantage point to question contemporary financial, political, and ethical commitments, prompting us to reconsider how modern society might intentionally break or redirect these reinforcing cycles toward more equitable and sustainable alternatives. In Debt, the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber meticulously traces how debt, violence, and economic power reinforced each other throughout history, creating self-perpetuating cycles of exploitation. One of the clearest illustrations of this reinforcing logic can be found in the emergence of capitalism through European colonial expansion. Beginning in the late 15th century, European powers engaged in aggressive territorial conquest in the Americas and Caribbean, establishing vast colonial empires through force. Graeber emphasizes that these conquests were not merely territorial. They were designed explicitly to extract value, wealth, and human resources from colonized populations and lands. As Europeans expanded their empires, colonization quickly became inseparable from the systematic commodification of human beings. The Atlantic slave trade was not merely an incidental aspect of colonialism. It was an essential economic mechanism sustaining colonial economies. Millions of Africans were violently taken from their communities and forced into brutal labor on plantations growing sugar, cotton, and tobacco. This human commodification generated enormous wealth, fundamentally shaping Europe's economy and enabling industrialization. Graeber argues that slavery was not peripheral but central, structurally embedding human commodification as the economic foundation of early capitalism. Yet, the ultimate significance of these plantations, in Graeber's analysis, was how they established patterns of coercive economic control that continue to reverberate today. The wealth derived from colonial human commodification directly reinforced the emergence of modern capitalist institutions, banks, insurance markets, joint stock corporations, and global financial networks. Without colonial conquest, large-scale human commodification wouldn't have occurred. Without slavery and forced labor, Europe's capitalist economy would not have developed as it historically did. This triadic reinforcement, colonial conquest leading to commodification of people, and human commodification underpinning a coercive control economy, clarifies how systems of economic power perpetuate themselves. Understanding this historical triad becomes profoundly relevant today, illuminating striking parallels in our contemporary economic landscape. In the modern world, corporate colonialism takes the place of European empires, as global digital giants like Amazon, Facebook, and Google expand aggressively into new markets and communities, dominating our digital lives, much as European colonizers dominated physical territories. This corporate expansion is not achieved through traditional military force, but through technological infrastructure, algorithms, platform centralization, and monopolistic power, enabling unprecedented global influence over billions of people. This corporate colonialism has produced a new kind of human commodification. Just as colonial plantations extracted profit from enslaved labor, contemporary digital corporations commodify human behaviors, identities, and social interactions. Every click, like, share, and transaction becomes a resource to be harvested, analyzed, and monetized. Personal data, once intangible and private, is extracted, packaged, and sold, creating immense wealth and cementing corporate dominance. The surveillance mechanisms that collect this data commodify our everyday lives. Our preferences, relationships, and behaviors become products in vast digital marketplaces. This leads directly to today's emerging control economy. Just as the Atlantic plantations shaped entire societies around coercive economic relationships, contemporary digital platforms organize our lives around data extraction and algorithmic influence. Decisions, choices, and opportunities, from credit scores to employment prospects, depend increasingly on algorithmic evaluation and data-driven assessments. Big tech companies wield immense power to shape economic behavior, cultural values, and political outcomes, effectively controlling individuals' access, influence, and participation. Without corporate colonialism, such extensive human commodification and a surveillance-based control economy could not exist. Reflecting upon Graeber's historical insights through this triad illuminates powerful continuities between past and present. Recognizing the structures that once enabled imperial conquest, human commodification, and the rise of capitalist control economies helps us understand the deeper logic behind today's digital platforms. It also forces us to confront challenging contemporary questions. Do we want to live in an economic landscape shaped by corporate monopolies, where our identities, relationships, and very humanity are commodified? Or can we reshape these systems toward fairer, more equitable forms of economic interaction, reclaiming autonomy in the digital age? Graeber's historical perspective thus becomes more than a look backward. It becomes a necessary tool for understanding, questioning, and potentially transforming the deeply entrenched systems that structure our modern world. In Debt, the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber challenges conventional assumptions about economic relationships, arguing that debt has always functioned not only as an economic mechanism, but as a powerful social and moral instrument. One especially illuminating example comes from ancient Indian Brahmanical society, where the notion of debt went beyond mere financial obligation. It represented profound spiritual and moral responsibilities. From birth, individuals were considered inherently indebted, not simply to each other but to ancestors, gods, and spiritual figures. These obligations framed the very essence of morality and personal identity, embedding economic responsibility deeply into the moral and religious fabric of society. This sacred framing of debt directly shaped the nature of economic interactions. In this setting, repaying debt wasn't merely settling financial accounts, it signified fulfilling moral duties. Every transaction, gift, or ritual exchange represented the discharge of these sacred debts, thus linking morality explicitly and continually to economics. Far from transactional neutrality, indebtedness was a measure of virtue, deeply influencing personal reputation and communal standing. Economic obligations were, therefore, never just practical arrangements. They defined an individual's moral legitimacy and social acceptance within the community. This intertwining of economic and moral obligations directly supported and justified rigid social hierarchies, reinforcing them at every step. Brahmanical society's caste structure was validated through this framework. The socially privileged carried fewer debts, symbolizing spiritual purity, while lower castes, viewed as spiritually burdened, remained perpetually economically obligated. Debt thus established clear distinctions between groups, creating and maintaining hierarchies under the guise of moral obligation. These social divisions were not accidental or incidental. They were essential elements in the self-sustaining cycle of moral justification and economic obligation. Together, these interconnected moral, economic, and social obligations created a tightly integrated system, each dimension reinforcing the others. Moral duty justified economic obligations structured social hierarchies, and those hierarchical structures in turn defined and reinforced moral and economic duties. Today, we can observe striking parallels in modern systems of higher education and student debt. Just as Brahmanical society defined moral responsibility through indebtedness, modern society increasingly frames higher education as an essential moral and social obligation. Pursuing a university degree has become almost synonymous with responsible adulthood, implying moral virtue in striving for personal growth, self-reliance, and socio-economic advancement. Yet this morally framed expectation creates significant economic burdens. Students, especially those from less privileged backgrounds, incur substantial debts to fulfill these moral and societal expectations, effectively entering adulthood economically obligated. The necessity of repaying student loans shapes career paths, personal choices, and financial stability for years or even decades. Just as ancient Indian obligations enforced conformity to moral ideals through economic indebtedness, today's educational debt reinforces compliance with societal norms of responsible adulthood, productivity, and economic discipline. Furthermore, this modern cycle of debt-driven education reinforces existing social hierarchies, echoing the Brahmanical model. Wealthier individuals, free from substantial debt burdens, enjoy greater professional and economic mobility, while those heavily indebted remain constrained in their choices, trapped within economic dependencies. Educational credentials become class markers, clearly delineating social and occupational hierarchies and legitimizing persistent inequality. Thus, just as ancient religious and moral obligations upheld caste divisions, modern educational debt perpetuates entrenched social stratifications under the veil of personal responsibility. As in ancient Brahmanical society, the modern student loan system tightly weaves moral, economic, and social obligations together. Moral expectations of education create economic debt. Economic debt obligates lifelong repayment and economic participation, cementing individuals into clearly defined societal roles. These clearly delineated roles reaffirm moral norms of responsible adulthood and social respectability. Debt, then and now, is not simply economic. It is moral, social, and inherently hierarchical. Reflecting carefully on this historical analogy offers vital insights into our contemporary conditions. It allows us to question whether educational obligations, morally framed as individual responsibilities, are inherently fair or equitable. Is indebtedness truly the appropriate measure of moral and social legitimacy? Or could education be reframed as a collective societal investment, free from hierarchical economic dependencies? By deeply understanding how debt historically connects morality, economy, and hierarchy, we can more clearly interrogate and potentially reshape the deeply embedded assumptions guiding modern education systems and their broader socio-economic impacts. David Graeber's insights reveal a profound truth. Debt is not merely a neutral financial instrument, but a powerful social force capable of structuring entire societies. The four historical analyses we've explored illustrate how debt consistently forms cycles, self-reinforcing loops of power, hierarchy, and inequality. From ancient Mesopotamia to colonial plantations, from Roman conquest to Brahmanical caste systems, each case vividly demonstrates that if left unchallenged, these cycles do not correct themselves. Instead, they deepen, entrench, and intensify. This insight carries urgent implications today. As our contemporary analogies illustrate, similar patterns are actively shaping our modern lives. Trust replaced by algorithmically managed reputation economies, military ambitions perpetuated by escalating national debts, digital monopolies transforming human experiences into commodities, and educational obligations reinforcing stark social hierarchies. Each of these cycles, like those Graeber traced historically, is structured to reinforce itself, to draw more resources, control, and human agency into its orbit. Left unchecked, they risk leading us into increasingly unjust, fragmented, and disempowering futures. The stark lesson of Graeber's analysis is that these patterns of indebtedness and exploitation don't collapse naturally. They collapse societies, communities, and human well-being. Historically, when societies failed to interrupt these cycles, the result was not stability but crisis, division, and violence. Rome collapsed under its own debt-driven militarism. Colonial economies built on human commodification violently shattered human lives and communities. Hierarchical systems like the caste structure entrenched oppression so deeply that escape seemed nearly impossible. Today, continuing down these paths threatens to push us further into surveillance economies that diminish human dignity, perpetual military spending cycles that divert resources from urgent human needs, and educational debt that exacerbates systemic inequality and economic precarity. Yet precisely because debt structures are socially constructed, Graeber's message contains hope and possibility. We can choose differently. By clearly understanding the destructive cycles of the past, we become empowered to challenge and remake the systems that define our present and shape our future. Rather than accepting a trajectory toward deeper inequality, dependence, and exploitation, we can instead choose to dismantle and re-envision these relationships, to rebuild economies founded on authentic trust rather than manipulated reputation, direct resources from militarized power toward social solidarity, reclaim digital spaces from corporate surveillance to human-centered communication, and transform educational systems from debt-driven stratification to equitable collective investment. But the choice is stark, urgent, and real. Without deliberate action, without recognizing and interrupting these self-reinforcing cycles, the negative trajectory Graeber identifies will inevitably intensify. The world shaped by debt need not be our future, but avoiding it requires understanding precisely how deeply these cycles penetrate our lives, and then consciously choosing to break them. Inaction does not mean stability. It means acceptance of growing inequality, erosion of social bonds, and diminished human freedom. In the end, Graeber's most powerful insight is both a warning and an invitation. The historical patterns show clearly what awaits if we fail to act, but also that debt is ultimately a human creation, not an unavoidable destiny. The very recognition of these destructive cycles provides the tools and the clarity to forge a better path forward. Acknowledging this stark choice enables us to reclaim agency, refuse complacency, and consciously build a world defined not by debt-driven exploitation, but by mutual dignity, collective solidarity, and genuine human flourishing.